Come down here and yell. So anyway, this is compiled under the Mongol Empire for Chinese use. Some will remember the talks I've given here before on this. This book was written in Chinese with Arabic and Persian drug names, excellently and accurately printed by the Chinese transliterators and translators. This work, we have about 500 pages surviving from a work of around 3,500 pages. The surviving material includes 3 chapters, chapters 12, 30, and 34. There are originally 36 chapters, and some of the table of contents. This is what's left of a Ming Dynasty edition. This book was compiled in the 1300s. It was reprinted in the Ming Dynasty in the middle 1400s. That's what we have. We have a little bit of a surviving reprint. Probably there were never more than a few copies of it because the thing was enormous. The surviving material has been published in 2 editions, one in Hong Kong, one in China itself. The principal work on this book is being done by Dr. Paul Buell of the Center for Chinese Research on Chinese Medical History at the Charity Hospital in Berlin. He's a historian of the Mongol Empire and of the Mongols in China, and he works especially on food and medical and administrative history. And I'm kind of hired gun doing the biology work because he doesn't know biology. Identification of the plants was mostly done by Huihui Yaofang, the great Chinese ethnobiologist who's had a over 70-year career now at Harvard as an ethnobotanist, still working, well over 100. Anyway, she had some students who got into this, and she and her students identified the commoner plant names, and Buell has been able to get the rest nailed down, and the animals. The Mongol Empire, as you probably know, was a high point of a process of conquest of most of the known world. And the Mongols got a very bad press. They're supposed to be these uncouth barbarians who went around killing people, but they actually caused this amazing information transfer. And they assembled quite a number of books of Central Asian knowledge for the Chinese, figuring that the Chinese were benighted and needed the benefit of this more advanced civilization, apparently. There's been this long history of Central Asia, of contact between China and the Near East across Central Asia. The first real good evidence we have from ethnobotany is when Chinese panic millet gets to Europe around 4,000 BC to 6,000 BC, 4,000? I know it's like 4,000. It goes back to 8,000 BC in China now. Anyway, then later, wheat and barley get to China by about 2,000 to 2,500 BC. Sheep and goats, maybe a little later. Horses by 1,500 BC. Apparently not before, right? We have a Central Asian archaeology expert in the audience who knows much more about this than I do. And interestingly enough, one of the interesting transfers was the West European honeybee, which came to China as a domesticate. And so the Chinese word for honey, mi, is a derivative of miao. That's a good, solid Indo-European word. And anyway, chickens went the other way about the same time. They were domesticated apparently by the Thai, because the Thai word for chicken is just all over Asia. It's the word for chicken everywhere except us English speakers and stuff. So anyway, this is not a new thing. You get medical transfer by the Han Dynasty, 200 BC to 200 AD roughly. You start getting medical lore coming over, and then the great Chinese physician who is now revered as the god of medicine, Sun Simiao, and some stuff that we've been working on. A Chinese historian and a medical historian and I have been kicking around the Sun Simiao's work for several years now. And he has a lot of Western medicine. He was quite aware of it as an interesting tradition that he was trying to synthesize with Chinese. It's fun to watch. So anyway, this brings us to the, I don't want to run over this too fast. So by the, backtracking a little bit, one of the most interesting kind of forgotten things is the Central Asian empires, which occurred on the borders of China, especially the Xiongnu Empire. Xiongnu is apparently the same word as Han, but the people aren't the same. They're earlier and probably spoke a different language. But anyway, they had a very large empire, which the Chinese dismissed as a bunch of nomads riding around on horses, but in fact they had a lot of settled agriculture, both dry farming and oasis agriculture. They had a big urban center. They conquered the Chinese borderlands for a long time. The Chinese finally went out and obliterated the Xiongnu Empire in around 130 BC, but there was a lot of transfer. And one of the interesting things about these Central Asian empires, the Chinese Empire was pretty religiously tolerant, but the Central Asian empires were very religiously tolerant. They'd allow anybody to believe any old thing. And so by the end of the pre-Islamic period in Central Asia, they had Zoroastrians and Christians of several denominations, and a few Muslims after the Muslims started to come in there, and Buddhists, lots of Buddhists, Chinese folk religion, all kinds of things, all mixing and merging. Anyway, so by the Tang Dynasty, which is 600 to 900 AD basically, you've got a wide range of Near Eastern plants in China and a very active transfer with people beginning to write books about Western stuff and why we should love it. And also, you're beginning to get Southeast Asian stuff coming in. So anyway, getting back to Sun Tzu Miao and his great book, Recipes Worth 1,000 in Gold, he talks about wheat, barley, basil, coriander, fennel, pomegranate, sugar beet, walnut, and several other items. They're first mentioned in China between 200 and 650 AD. Several of them are medicinal herbs. He's giving you the medicinal value of all of them very briefly, very quickly. And he also manages to mention betel nut, cardamom, pomelo, and sugarcane, which were coming in from Southeast Asia. So, anyway, getting now to the Mongols, if you've looked at Jack Weatherford's book, anthropologist who looked at the Mongol Empire a while ago, he points out that the Mongols were quite civilized by the time they conquered China and had a very sophisticated empire, and were not just a bunch of uncouth barbarians. Although very strangely, Jack Weatherford credits this ridiculous story about the Chinese, about the Mongols cooking meat by warming it between their thighs and their horses' backs. This is a ridiculous lie which was started by the Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus talking about the Huns. And nobody ever even pretended the Mongols really did that, except modern historians who kind of thought that Ammianus Marcellinus must be right because he was Roman, and the Huns and the Mongols are the same people anyway. Oh, come on. I mean, this is the kind of thing that you've got in old-time history, and I'm surprised that Weatherford put that in. But anyway, just so you know. Anyway, the Mongols brought a lot of foodstuffs, well, not that many, but they brought some foodstuffs to China. And interestingly enough, China did not contribute very many foodstuffs to the West via Central Asia, because most of China's native food plants are native to the warm, moist climate areas, which means, of course, they're not going to grow in Central Asia, which, as you know, is a cold desert, basically. Soybeans never got out of East Asia at all until modern times. And rice, oranges, tangerines, black-eyed peas, limes, all that good stuff spread through Southeast Asia to India to the Near East. Those things could not go through Central Asia. And they were spreading at about the same time, and the Mongols may have helped with the spread. So anyway, the most interesting new thing that turns up in the Yuan dynasty in China is the carrot. And the reason the Chinese hadn't borrowed the carrot earlier is that the carrot probably didn't exist earlier. It was bred in Afghanistan, where apparently there were native orange carrots. In Europe, the carrot has this little struggly root and was mainly used as a folk abortifacient. You can do a rather horribly unpleasant job of aborting yourself by boiling down carrot tops, wild carrot tops, not domestic ones. Don't try it. And so that was the way it was used in good old Europe, if you were desperate, because they had much safer ones. So the orange carrot was bred up in Afghanistan in the Middle Ages, and so it got to China with the Mongols. Another thing that may have come in about that time, but we don't know much about its history, is the broad bean. The broad bean is a Near Eastern bean. It was developed very, very early in the Near East. It spread to West China and kind of stayed in West China. It didn't get to the rest of China. And so we don't really know when it was introduced. The Chinese first start talking about it in the Mongol period, but it was probably around a lot earlier in places where Chinese writers didn't go. And they call it, in the Middle Ages, now tends to be called Zando, but originally, and still sometimes it's called Hudo, the Iranian bean, Persian bean. So anyway, now getting to the Huihui Yaofang, I'm not going to have time to ask field questions, or maybe I will. There's about 148 foods that are actually mentioned in the Huihui Yaofang out of around 300 herbal remedies of one sort or another. They have everything, minerals and so forth in there. But there's 148 foods. We know what foods were listed in the entire thing because fortunately the table of contents of the last part of the encyclopedia is preserved. And the foods are separately listed there. They have separate sections on all the foods. And they included weasel, bat, lizard, and crocodile. Heaven knows what they were doing with those. Another thing that's interesting is the active ingredients. There's the drugs which were actually used in the Huihui Yaofang, which we know work. First, the narcotics, opium, of course, especially, but henbane, marijuana, 2 or 3 others. Then there's a second category of stimulants, most of which are spices. We now use them for spicing, but they were originally domesticated for stimulant drug use. Cinnamon, saffron, black pepper, a whole bunch of apiaceous fruits, fennel seeds and anise seeds and stuff like that. Then there's soothing plants, lavender, myrrh, lemon balm, a whole bunch of herbs that have a soothing effect. Lavender oil works directly on your brain. It actually has a direct soothing effect. The scent of lavender oil actually directly changes your brain chemistry in a soothing way. Fourth are plants that are clearly vermifuge, vermifuge will kill intestinal worms, especially wormwood. And then especially the most interesting thing is how many of these plants really are strongly antiseptic and antifungal. Lavender oil is one. Thyme oil, rose oil, saffron, cinnamon, a lot of these things. The reason that we like spices, by the way, it's perfectly clear. A biologist named Paul Sherman and I independently thought of this, and he published first, which is great, because he did a better job. But it's very clear that the reason people like the spices they like and use the spices and flavorings they use is that they're antibiotic, and that we have evolved to like and respond well to the smells of things like thyme oil and sage oil and lavender oil and mint oil. These are very, very strongly protective and antibiotic chemicals, which are still used in medical practice, actually. And they're in this book. These guys knew what they were talking about. Then there's another category of things that are effective diuretics and purgatives, emetics, things like that. They've got castor oil in there. They've got euphorbia in there. They've got some of these strongly purgative morning glory type things in there. And then there's quite a number of things, especially one of the chapters that's preserved is the chapter on wounds. And there, of course, you would expect that they have a lot of antiseptic and a lot of soothing drugs, and yeah, they do. So an interesting thing is that where Sun Simiao in his medical work of 654 AD mentions 8 Western foods, the Huihui Yaofang is up to 67. And if you look at modern China, there's about 100 Western foods that are used in Western China now. There's about 17 Chinese foods that are used, 10 of which are really medicinal. And one of the things that was a problem for these guys is trying to find Chinese substitutes for drugs that you simply couldn't get in East Asia. And also, and often, unfortunately, they got Chinese substitutes that don't work for Western plants that do work. And so this thing was not the greatest contribution to medicine. It wasn't as great as it might have been. So I'm trying to leave a couple of minutes for questions, so I'll just stop there.